Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, author of novels and nonfiction. My most recent book is out today. It's a short nonfiction called Unspoken.
I'm Molly Jo Riley, producer of the podcast and author of several books, which you can find on Kindle at Amazon and The Unemployment Cookbook.
And got a couple of reminders for you again this week, as we do every week. If you are listening to the audio-only podcast, you can see us live at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Google Hangouts. If you would like to do that, add Firsts in Fiction podcast at gmail.com to your Google Plus circles, and you'll receive our invitations for our upcoming shows. Make sure that if you are watching on YouTube that you click that thumbs up button. It really helps us out. Don't be afraid to subscribe and tell some friends about us, and hopefully they'll subscribe. We are close to 100 subscribers now. I think we're up to 72, so we're a stone's throw away from 100 subscribers. So that's kind of a the first step in YouTubing. So if you guys could help us get there, that would be appreciated. And we are looking forward next week, since it will be our final week in July, to a wild card episode. Now we've got a couple ideas that we've got working together, a couple in the mix here, but interested to hear what you think. So if, as you're listening tonight, those of you in the chat room come up with some ideas, don't be afraid to suggest those to us in the room, and we'll be sure to take a look at those at the end of the show, and we'll make a decision this week and let you guys know at some point in the coming week what our topic will be. It'll be fun, no matter what we pick. It'll be fun. You'll want to be here for that. So let's move on to our Ask the Author question. And today's Ask the Author question comes from one Aaron Gansky, who asks a specific author, Alton Gansky, about his latest nonfiction release, Unspoken, about William Jennings Bryan. Pops, why don't you tell us a little bit about your book and the process in writing it and putting it up and all of that good stuff?
Sure. When I was doing 30 Events That Shaped the Church, which is a full-length nonfiction book by Baker, I fell in love with one of the topics, which was the Scopes trial of 1925. This week is the 91st anniversary of that trial, and so I began doing more and more research beyond what I did in that book, which is just a chapter, and I wanted to put out a small nonfiction book, novella size, like 120 pages, something like that. And so it is, in essence, a history book, but don't let that scare you off. It's, I think, kind of a fun book. And what Unspoken is it's about the Scopes trial. I've got a chapter in there about the Scopes trial, so everybody has a nice grounding in it. And the final speech of William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan ran for president 3 times, lost each time. There were a lot of wealthy business people who had poured in a ton of money to make sure he was defeated. But nonetheless, he was the youngest man ever to run for president, first one to campaign for his own position as president. Normally it was done by other people, but he went out and campaigned for himself. And he was later Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, whom he helped get elected, and he was responsible for, he was just heavily participated in 3 constitutional amendments that we have. So kind of a mover and shaker, known as a great orator. Well, his job in the Scopes trial, which was about whether or not evolution could be taught in schools, public schools, where the state pays the teacher. And this thing called the Butler Bill passed early 1925, and John T. Scopes agreed to be a test case. The ACLU out of New York wanted to test the law, whether or not you could prohibit a teacher from teaching evolution. I remember this 1925, so it may sound a little strange. Anyway, William Jennings Bryan was going to be there. His job primarily as an orator, although he was an attorney, but he hadn't practiced for 30 years. But he was to be the orator, to speak and give the summation. Well, Clarence Darrow and others outmaneuvered him, and since they didn't give closing remarks, the prosecution couldn't deliver closing remarks. Well, the irony and the sad thing is this is the last speech that William Jennings Bryan wrote. He only got to deliver it a couple of times outside of the courthouse, and then he died 5 days after the trial. So what I did is I just took the speech, which became a book in 1925, and I went through and I analyzed it so readers of today could understand what it was he was saying, why he was saying it, put it in the context of the time, put it in the context of the trial, and try to straighten up a few misstatements about William Jennings Bryan. He's portrayed badly in history and inaccurately, so it's not a defense of him, but I just wanted to straighten a few of those things out. So I go through the whole speech, and I make remarks in the text along the way. It is available now on Kindle. It'll be available on the other ebook platforms a little later. It's still in process with some of these others like iBooks and Barnes and Noble and stuff. They always take a little bit longer than Amazon does. And once I sign off on the physical book, which I should have this week, then we'll have the physical book too, the print book out. So probably have all of that ready by next week. But it's on Kindle right now.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Pops. A really fascinating read. I got the opportunity to read through it, and some really fascinating stuff I did not know, and it's intriguing. I'm not a history buff by any stretch of the imagination. I don't read historical fiction or nonfiction for the most part, but I did find this really intriguing, if nothing else, just for the legal maneuvering that went on, and then of course for the great speech that he wrote. So if you get an opportunity and you're interested in that kind of stuff, you definitely want to pick it up. One of the ideas, Pops, that we batted around for our nonfiction for our wild card next week is nonfiction writing for fiction writers, because it's becoming increasingly important for fiction writers to also be able to write nonfiction, be it from a blog or I've done a couple nonfiction books on the craft of writing, so that's kind of my niche and what I talk about is the craft of writing, and others are authorities on history or architecture or whatever the case may be, some careers that they've come from. They seem to be kind of experts in those fields, and they will blog about them, write about them, and kind of cross-pollinate their fiction with their nonfiction. So in your experience, Pops, just real quick, in context of, you've done several nonfiction books, several fiction books, and obviously I imagine that the weight is a little heavier in favor of the fiction writing, but just in the nonfiction, do you find some crossover there between ways to write good nonfiction versus ways to write good fiction?
Yeah, it's my belief that writers are communicators and can be entertainers, especially in fiction. One of the goals is to entertain, but they often carry some kind of message with them. And when I think I've written 12 nonfiction books, but I remember the first one was really tough to do because it was so different than everything I had been doing, the fiction writing. And I always thought I'd be a nonfiction writer, but I don't know, I sold 10 or 12 novels before I sold a nonfiction book. It's just the way it worked out. But it was very difficult, and I remember in the first book I got 3 chapters in and realized that I wasn't writing a nonfiction book for readers. I was writing a term paper for a professor, and had to throw them out and start over again. And it's a different part of the brain. But what you mentioned, I think, is very important, especially today, because writers have to do a lot of their own promotion. And so that usually means blog writing, sometimes article writing, sometimes speech writing, and those kinds of things. So today, the well-rounded novelist also has to do some of these other things. And so learning to do nonfiction, I think, is extremely important. And when you do it, it improves your fiction, the way the words go together. So I think it's been a big help for me. I enjoy it a great deal, even though I've written far many more novels than I have nonfiction.
Yeah, I agree. I find myself writing quite a bit of nonfiction as well. No, not necessarily for publication purposes, though I do have a couple of nonfiction books on the craft of writing available, but more so just the blogging and things of that nature, so articles and the like. So it is a reality of the industry. So that's one of the ideas that we're kicking around. But tonight we're going to continue our discussion of point of view, moving from first to second, second to third, and that's where we find ourselves this week is third-person point of view. Now, in third-person narration, the narrator is uninvolved in the action of the story. In first person, your protagonist is the hero, if you will. They are The one who is narrating the story is the one who's participating in the story. In second person, you could argue that the reader takes on the role of the protagonist. Others would argue that second person is an extension of first person. Regardless, third person, I think we can all agree that the narrator is uninvolved in the action of the story, unless you're reading Kurt Vonnegut Jr., in which case his novels are rife with authorial intrusions. If you are not sure what an authorial intrusion is, I will tell you. Thank you so much for asking. An authorial intrusion is specifically in third-person narration, where the narrator inserts themselves as the author into the text. You get this a lot in some of the old school stuff, Pops, that you'll talk about here in a minute, but you see it a lot in Kurt Vonnegut. He became famous for it. And even though authorial intrusions are considered a no-no, he actually kind of made a career with it, specifically in Slaughterhouse-Five with his his protagonist, Billy Pilgrim. He would say something in the book like, "War is like glaciers," Billy Pilgrim thought, meaning that wars are inevitable, they can't be stopped. And then he would say, "I believe that too." So this insertion of I, speaking as Kurt Vonnegut Jr., as the writer of the book, is this break in the fictive dream. It's where the author steps in and says, "Hey, don't forget you're reading a book. Also, I believe this." It's considered a no-no because it does break the fictive dream. Kurt Vonnegut was able to pull it off, I think in part because he's a fascinating individual, and his voice was so unique and compelling that a lot of people really fell in love with Kurt Vonnegut's presentation of who Kurt Vonnegut was, whether or not that's how he actually was, but it's how he presented himself in his novels. And a lot of people felt that he had adopted their voice and that he spoke with their words, said things more eloquently than they could, but still expressed their beliefs and their ideas. And so that's how he was able to get away with it. I would caution you against it. Pops, you see this sometimes in the 19th century works. You've got a nice example here.
Right, yeah, and you're saying some good stuff there because writing changes over time, and a lot of people get trapped in saying, I want to write like they did in the 1920s. Well, there's probably not many publishers that are going to do that unless you're extremely talented and have just the right hook. So things change. So, for example, like in 19th century works in the 1800s, you could come across phrases like this in novels. Rain fell in sheets and our hero needed shelter. Before him loomed a mighty mansion with lights burning in the windows. Okay, so far so good. Nice third person. Little did our hero know what horrors awaited him behind the mansion's mighty oak doors. That's authorial intrusion. He's predicting what's going to happen. He's foreshadowing, setting up that this is a problem, and rather than showing us that there's something weird going on, he just tells us this is not a safe place to be. And that's a shortcut that some writers try to do because they're afraid the reader's not going to understand. Reader's not smart enough to know that this big, looming, dark mansion, this foreboding place might have something dangerous inside it. So, having that fear, the author just says, little does he know the great danger that he's in. And that's really a no-no these days. In contemporary fiction, that would be considered bad form to do.
Indeed, it is bad form to do. The little did he know, however, is always intrigues me because of the movie Stranger Than Fiction with Will Ferrell. Pops, have you ever seen that?
I was reading one of the comments from the room. I'm sorry, say it again.
Have you seen Will Ferrell's movie Stranger Than Fiction?
Yes.
With Dustin Hoffman and what does Dustin Hoffman says? I can't help you, and then Will Ferrell says, "Well, okay, I thought you could." It was just when the voice said, "Little did he know that this would end in his ultimate demise." Dustin Hoffman goes off. Wait a minute, little did he know? I've written papers on Little Did He Know. I've taught classes and given lectures on Little Did He Know, and that's when he becomes interested in it. So I always think of that. It's a great movie if you get an opportunity to see it. Dustin Hoffman does an incredible job. Will Ferrell, this is not a typical Will Ferrell movie. He's very understated and subtle. He's actually a pretty fine actor when he lets himself. I liken it to Jim Carrey's The Truman Show, where he kind of actually demonstrated that he's got acting chops. He's not just a goofball. I'm completely off topic now. Let's get back to third person, shall we? Sorry.
But Tess in the room asked a great question about one of our favorite authors that we talk about here from time to time, Clive Cussler. Clive Cussler, in his later books, would insert himself into the story. It's a walk-on part. It's Alfred Hitchcock stepping off a bus in one of his movies, that sort of thing. He makes a quick appearance and then disappears. Or perhaps a more modern one would be seeing Stan Lee in the Marvel movies. He's in most of the Marvel movies. It's just a bit part, and it's sort of a joke. So she asked, would Clive Cussler inserting himself as a character in a story be authorial intrusion? I think that's hilarious. I suppose it's the ultimate authorial intrusion, except as a character in his own book, he doesn't give away stuff to the reader, and he doesn't talk to the reader. But it's a hilarious concept because, yeah, I guess that is authorial intrusion if you write yourself into the story.
I'm going to have to try that sometime. That sounds like way too much fun.
Well, I want to do it because I want to make myself younger, trimmer, and richer. So.
Kurt Vonnegut Jr. does it in Breakfast of Champions. He has himself drinking in a bar with the protagonist, and then he's, for whatever reason, stumbling out drunk and chased by Dobermans trying to get over a chain link fence running for his life. And so yeah, he does that too. Kurt Vonnegut makes appearances in his books from time to time, and it's fun. It still counts as an authorial intrusion. Yes, it's not as direct as the author addressing the reader. Little did he know, dear reader, that kind of a thing. It's a little bit different, but still kind of the same concept. Now, obviously in third person, you're going to be using third person pronouns. So in first person, you use first person pronouns, I, me, my, mine, etc. Second person would be you, your, yours, etc. And then third person is going to be he, she, they, etc. So you get sentences like, Billy Pilgrim didn't think much of his wife Valencia, but he could see the rest of his life with her, and it wasn't awful, so he married her. It's not a direct quote, but it's something like that.
Wow.
He ends up proposing to. Oh, it's so bad. Billy Pilgrim is the ultimate loser, but it's kind of funny. So you get the proper noun. Billy Pilgrim didn't think much of his wife Valencia, but he could see the rest of his life, rather than I didn't think much of my wife, but I could see the rest of my life with her, and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. So pronouns are going to be a little bit different. Now, we do have several different types here. So rather than me telling you all of them, Pops, I'll do the the first one here. Distant, maybe you can do limited, and then I'll do omniscient. We'll just kind of trade back and forth. That sound all right?
Yeah, this is really a key point for writers, especially new writers who don't understand that there are different types of third person. And that's the thing about third person. It's used so often. It's the primary means of telling a story, not the only, as we've seen with first and second, and some great books have been done in first person. But third is in what they call big books, those that are meant to be monster bestsellers and stuff like that. They're almost always third person. There are exceptions to it. I'm thinking Sue Grafton writes first person, and she's always on a bestseller list. So it's not a requirement, but often you will find third person books more numerous in awards and in the bestseller lists than you will first person. So yeah, go ahead and tell us about one of these first distinctions, third person distant.
Third person distant is often called, or sometimes called third person camera, like in a movie. And the idea here is that your narrator is distant. They are unable to see into the minds of the characters. You'll never see them say, Billy Pilgrim was sad. You'll never hear them say, Billy Pilgrim thought fondly of his wife Valencia, because the narrator cannot know what the character is thinking or what the character is feeling. Here, the narration is simply what you would see on a screen. It describes, again, what you might see in a movie. Think of a movie. It doesn't say, the actress is sad. You just see an actress crying, and you infer, oh, she must be sad. Mm-hmm. Because of that, the narrator cannot say or cannot describe emotions unless the character acts it out. Cannot relay any interior dialogue or share any sort of interior monologue. They can only present the action. They can only present what's being spoken, what would be seen on the screen, They might say things like the air is heavy with the smell of blah, blah, blah. So they can describe still in all 5 senses, but they're not going to have that, gee, I hate my boss, Bobby thought. You're not going to get that because, again, the narrator is distant. And there are specific reasons for using something like that. Usually it's because you want a narrative distance. You want the reader to feel a little more distance from your narrator, especially if your narrator is unlikable in some way. Some people will choose to do a distant narration, so they're not forcing the reader into an uncomfortable psyche, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I had an event here this week where I had to call the police. I was witnessing something going on, and so I'm on 911, and the person I was talking to wanted me to describe everything I was seeing. And so I was some distance away. I could see the big actions, but a car was involved, and I couldn't see into the car. I couldn't see into the mines. I didn't know what the original intent was. I didn't know if it was a crime going on, if it was a domestic disturbance. I didn't have enough information. And so in a sense, that's what you get with a third-person distant narrator. You can see a lot of things, you just can't see everything. So there is that distance between, just like I had that distance between me and that event that was going on with that. So, yeah.
I think this is a good challenge for writers who are constantly writing in first person or third person close or limited, depending on how you want to say it, because you cannot describe. It makes telling a lot harder because you can't say Billy was sad. You have to show Billy's sadness. So you do have to get very good at describing body language and the other actions that are demonstrating the interior thoughts and feelings. And so it's a good exercise for those of you who find yourself telling too often. Try and take that step back and just show rather than telling. And you can do that very effectively with third person distant. So.
And it's a greater challenge, I think, because technically all emotions are physical. In fact, the word emotion comes from E and motion. It means motion inside. So that's where the term comes from. So it's difficult to describe an emotion because normally it would be done in physical terms. The pulse was pounding. You could feel his face flush and stuff like that. But if you're third person distant, you can't describe what they're feeling on the inside. So the person would have to clutch at their stomach, or they might clench their fists. And so you could only you can only relate what you could see, but you can't get into their mind, into their heart, into their gut. And so it requires, I think, a little greater skill to be able to do that faithfully and effectively. And so it takes some talent.
How would you, along that lines, how would you recommend somebody, a new writer, do something like that? Because the examples you just gave were great, but isn't there's a propensity for us to show, when we do the show don't tell, to show too much of it. Where do you draw the line between, giving too much information and just expressing what's going on internally?
Yeah, if I understand the question, first of all, I would say when you're doing your first draft, show whatever you want. Tell whatever you want. Doesn't really matter. You're getting the story down. Don't get caught up or trapped in that. The real writing takes place in the rewriting, as we've said here in Al's axiom, whatever number, 5 or whatever it is, that writing is putting words on a page. Great writing is taking words off a page. So I would just write the story. Then I'd go back and say, for whatever reason, I'm going to be distant. I'm going to be a movie camera. And so I'm not going to relate anything that wouldn't show up on a camera. And for whatever reason you do that, then you have to go back and challenge everything that is internal. So if you have somebody said you wouldn't say he felt angry, that's telling, not showing. But if you talk about a racing heart, if you're talking about a tightness in the stomach, muscles becoming tense, those sorts of things on the inside, you'll either have to show it as if you were standing there looking at them, or give up on third-person distance and move to something that's a little easier, and not less important, but it's a little easier to describe what's going on because you can get into someone's head, which I think is our next one. Does that help? Or?
Yes.
Good. I would also say get very good at people watching. and put down 3 or 4 behaviors or actions that demonstrate the internal feeling, and then pick the one that's most natural to your character that best shows, and then you can keep the others in your back pocket for later. But for now, you write 3 or 4 and then find the one that fits. So is that helpful?
Yes.
All right. How does this differ, Pops, this third-person distant? How does it differ from third-person limited?
Well, in third-person limited point of view, the narrator not only sees what's going on in the action, in the scene, but they can look into the mind of one character. But the kicker here is the narrator faithfully sticks to the one character. There's no head jumping. You're not going to go from person to person to person. So it's the equivalent of a first-person story told with third-person point of view, third-person pronouns and the like, but you're only revealing the thoughts, the actions, the feelings, the ruminations, the thinkings, the fears of one person and no one else. You don't get to see into the psyche of anyone else. So third-person limited is a little more than third-person distant, but only by one person. So Billy Pilgrim was sad. When he frowned, his wife did too. We can get into Billy Pilgrim's thinking there, but we're not going to get into his wife's thinking. We just can see that she frowns when he frowns. So again, it's third-person point of view, but it's told as though it were a first person by focusing on one character and one character alone. Now again, and we will see this anytime we have this kind of discussion, someone will bring up, well, so-and-so did this and they won an award, so-and-so did this. There's always exceptions to the rule. But if you're a writer trying to get published, it's best to choose what publishers are taking, and then once you're established, you can start veering off on things. And there will, again, always be exceptions to the rule. You always have a Kurt Vonnegut who pops up and does things technically wrong. I'm putting that in air quotes for those not watching the video. Technically wrong, but they do it so well, it's right. Ray Bradbury again, and Rendezvous with Ramesses. Far too much narration, but he does it so well that you don't notice it. So it's not a problem for him. He masters it. Ray Bradbury, a lot of narration and description and that sort of thing. And he can do it in a way most writers can't. So those kinds of folks who have a knack for that can pull it off. But if you're trying to break in, you want to go with what editors are buying now. So third-person limited, you get to see through the eyes of one person. Not through the eyes of the camera, but through the eyes of one person.
Exactly. And third-person omniscient, very much the same thing, except instead of sticking with one character, you can go into any character's point of view. Omniscient means all-knowing, all science, all knowledge. That's what omniscient means. And so the term is used here to describe a narrator who can see into every character's point of view, their thoughts, their feelings, etc. Now, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And usually what we're talking about here is third-person omniscient is the narrator will pick a few particular characters and peek into their minds. So we'd get something like, Billy Pilgrim didn't feel sad. He didn't feel much of anything. He thought of animal crackers. Valencia was worried about the car payment and what she was going to make for dinner. And so now we've gone into two different people's points of view and to their minds. And so this would be considered omniscient. Now, I think we may actually talk about this a little bit later. Omniscient can be very problematic if you're trying to go into what everybody in a single room at a single time is thinking. That's going to be confusing. We call that head hopping, jumping from what one person is thinking into what the next person is thinking. And for the most part, I would say don't do this. It's too confusing. And then Stephen King writes Under the Dome, and everybody's like, isn't that awesome? And I think, no, I wasn't a huge fan. It was an interesting book, but he does this third-person omniscient head hopping. He goes into the point of view, I think I've mentioned before, of a bird and a gopher and a dog and all these different points of view that that are sometimes related, and sometimes you're just in somebody's point of view long enough for them to die in some traumatic, horrible way. But he'll have 4 or 5 people in a room, and he's going back and forth between what's going through each of their minds. And to a certain extent, it's like, well, that's kind of cool because now I know what everybody's thinking, and there's some tension here. The drawback is I'm getting confused as to who's thinking what. It's harder to kind of keep track. And so most editors now will tell you, if you're in third-person omniscient, do not head hop. Do not go from in one scene. You can do it scene by scene. Everything in this scene is Billy Pilgrim's point of view. Everything in the next scene is Valencia's point of view. That's fine. But doing them all together gets a little bit confusing. And so this kind of a problem, if you will, seems to have led to our next one. And really, I don't think you're going to find this in any craft books unless you're reading the craft books that I've written. It's just kind of something that I've described to my students to describe a trend that I've seen lately, which is kind of an offshoot of the third-person omniscient, which is what I call third-person serial limited. So, Pops, you want to talk a little bit about that?
No, I want to back up to the omniscient and make a couple of quick comments. This is sometimes called the God POV, the God point of view, because an all-knowing God knows what everyone's thinking, feeling, that sort of thing. And in a book chooses to reveal some of these things in the story. And when we talk about not head hopping, which I usually call a point of view shift, which means you just move from one person to the next person, and it's very difficult for the reader to follow. Tom Clancy did this in one of his books, where Paul Ryan is now not Paul Ryan. That's like politics on brain.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Jack Ryan.
Jack Ryan.
Isn't it Jack Ryan?
Yes.
I think it's Jack Ryan. Yeah, now I'm confused because Paul Ryan. Anyway, I got to quit watching news.
You got the Ryan part right.
I got the Ryan part. He's now president of the United States. He's at a party. He's wearing a tux, and he's seen a room where this party's going on, and a female Secret Service agent walks in. And the next line is, "He looks wonderful in a tux." And I remember reading that, stopping, saying, "Who looks wonderful in a tux? The woman? This doesn't make sense. She's wearing a tux?" And what he had done is he had taken one line, made an internal dialogue for the protagonist, internal dialogue for the walk-on scene, this female Secret Service agent, and it got very confusing. If I'd been editing, and I will never have the success that he did, so forgive me for saying this, but if I were editing, I would take the line out because it was too jarring. If you do have to, in the same scene, in the same place, switch heads, then you put in what's called a hiatus break. That's an extra line space. It's white. On your manuscript, you usually put in 3 asterisks or 3 pound signs, center those. And that's just so the editors and those who will typeset it later will know that you want a white space there. And that way you indicate to the reader we are switching either in time, or place, or in point of view. And that's fine. Just don't mash them up together because it gets very confusing. All right. Did I confuse everything there?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yep.
Thank you.
I'm totally confused.
Thank you.
And we're all back. I think we're good. So now it's clear. Aaron Gansky was confused. Molly Jo was thinking, this is perfectly clear to me. Aaron Gansky must be stupid. There, I was trying to give another example and just make things even more confusing.
Molly kept thinking, when will Aaron stop speaking for me?
Aaron kept wondering why Aaron was speaking in third person.
And this is where I step in and take over, right?
It is, yes,
Yes,
Pops. Third person
please.
serial limited.
Third person serial limited. Are you talking about that or am I?
I'll do it. I'll take it real quick. This is just, again, a name that I've slapped on something that I've seen. Kind of I don't know if it's I don't want to call it a fad. I think it's a solid method to telling a story. And so what third person serial limited is it's a series of limited third person POVs. You see this in the Game of Thrones. Chapter 1 is Ned, and everything's from his point of view. Chapter 2 might be Tyrion, and everything's going to be from his point of view. So Chapter 1 is Billy Pilgrim. Billy Pilgrim hadn't been happy since his 4th birthday. And you go on to talk about Billy Pilgrim. Chapter 2 might be Valencia Pilgrim. Valencia Pilgrim used to think her wedding day was the happiest of her life, but now she wondered if she'd been wrong this whole time. And so it's just a way of moving from one perspective to the next. Either it's by chapter or it's by scene. I do this in Hand of Adonai. I have 3 point of view characters. I believe I have 3 point of view characters in the first Hand of Adonai series, and I move between them. Each scene is told in one third-person limited from one character's point of view. The next one will be told in another character's limited point of view, and so on and so forth. And I tend to add these. This really works well for epic novels, novels of on a larger scale, where you're going to have multiple perspectives. And these tend to be longer books, not shorter books. But the method is been tried, and it has been successful, and I feel like it's going to continue to be successful because it allows for a larger scope of story, but still gives you kind of that gives the reader the personal relationship with the individual protagonist, chapter by chapter or scene by scene. So, did I cover everything on Serial Limited, Pops?
Yeah, I think so, and I've seen this done a number of times. It's a pretty good technique, really, if when you have more than one protagonist. And maybe more than one main protagonist, which you usually don't, but you can. And I've seen that where each chapter begins with a name. That's the chapter title. Mm-hmm. And so you know whose point of view you're in. You can also do it with places. If you have things happening all over the world, you can do that too. Not normally done, but it's got some potential to it if handled properly.
Absolutely. So, Pops, what are some advantages to writing in third person?
Well, there's really a lot of advantages, and that's why authors of novels, especially larger novels, will choose third person. Rule of thumb, and understand this is generalization. Again, there will always be exceptions. Generally, you want to use first person when you want to keep information away from the reader. And that's why it works so well in mysteries, is you don't want the reader being able to see clues that other people see, but not your protagonist. Where if you're in third person, you might have to jump into that head to be fair to the reader. So first person is great for limiting point of view. Third person, that's very limited. Same kind of thing where you're just dealing with one person. But general third person allows for different perspectives. It allows for you to create subplots, and that's what you usually need in larger books, because you're going to have a main plot, and there's going to be 1, 2, maybe 3 subplots going on, which also means then you can have more conflict, so it keeps the pace going for different characters. Third person allows for the expression of different responses to plot points, actions, and so on. So what the hero the way the hero may respond at one plot point being a turning point in the story, a door that the protagonist walks through and can't go back through again. So it's a key point. If you're doing a 3-act structure, you have one between Act 1 and Act 2, and between Act 2 and Act 3. Usually you have one in the middle too, 50%. But if different people are going to see whatever that plot point is, that crisis, that problem, they're going to respond to it differently. Third person will allow you to do those kinds of things. It allows different angles on the plot problem. So that's what I was just saying here, but put it a different way by calling it angles. The protagonist sees it one way, a supporting protagonist sees it another, the antagonist sees it his or her way. And then third person has this other advantage, is reading is vicarious living. You live through the characters. When you're in first person, the reader can only live through one person. Third person, the reader can live in the minds of several different people. So they can be the bad guy, they can be the hero, they can be the victim, they can be all those different things. So it gives you as a writer a chance to manipulate more, to touch more hot buttons, to generate a few more tears in the reader or laughter in the reader, whatever it is that you're going after. Third person gives you a lot more elbow room with it. So I love writing first person. I find it easier. I find it very enjoyable. But third person for me is the one that really does the work. It toes the load.
I agree. It's got like you say, you just mentioned a ton of advantages, and I think that's why it's so popular. I feel like a lot of beginning writers start in first person because it's more natural to them to speak in first person, to continue writing in first person, but I think third person is a way of stretching your wings a little bit. Usually, third person narration is assumed to be a little more reliable. We talked a couple weeks ago about the reliability of narrators and what an unreliable narrator is. Typically, most people will assume third-person narration is more reliable because you've got a narrator telling the story rather than the characters, and so their version of the story should be pretty accurate. It gives you the advantage to being able to narrate multiple scenes, so you can build suspense. I like to give this example of a scene with children getting onto a school bus. That's pretty boring. However, if you precede that with a scene of the bad guy building a bomb and putting it under a school bus, now kids getting on the bus is a lot more interesting. It's more terrifying. And you can't really do that in first person if a kid, normal school day, is getting on a bus. You would have to blow the bus up to show that something's wrong. Here, the bomb never has to go off. But the fact that we saw him put a bomb under the bus, now we're terrified. And we will read about that bus trip with unbelievable attention and fear because we want to know that these kids are going to be okay. You can't really accomplish that in first person if your character is going to be on the bus. You have to be able to narrate, go beyond that, show the bad guy. It allows also for narrative distance, and again, this kind of helps add to the reliability of the narrator. The narrator can actually make judgments on the characters, say things like, Billy Pilgrim didn't much love anything. He was a droll fellow. Okay, so you can make that kind of a judgment, whereas in first person, you're probably not going to have somebody think, I'm a bit of a droll fellow. And you see what I'm saying? Billy Pilgrim unwisely decided to cross the street without looking both ways. The word unwisely should not be in there because some would argue it's an authorial intrusion, but it's making a narrative judgment on the characters. You cannot do that in first person or second person. So, it gives you that ability. It also allows you to follow multiple characters and allows readers, as you were saying earlier, Pops, to live vicariously through lots of them, but also to pick the one that they most resonate with. If I were to mention The Lord of the Rings, we all probably have our own favorite. And it's not Frodo. I think we can all agree. But regardless, we can all have our own favorites because we get to spend time with each of the protagonists and get into their minds and their hearts, etc. So lots of advantages there. However, there are some disadvantages. For example, some readers have a harder time taking on the role of a particular character. They may not like a particular character, so if a third of your book is in one particular point of view and your character hates that point, or your reader hates that character, that point of view, that's problematic. So you've got to make sure that each of your characters has some sort of likable quality to them, some sort of sympathetic aspect to them. The head hopping can be confusing, which we've already talked about. Can make it hard if there's too many characters. It can make it hard for the reader to follow what's happening and to whom, especially if your characters have very similar names. One of the most interesting comments I got from an early beta reader of Hand of Adonai series was that the character names are too similar. I had Erica and I had Kara, and so he says, I'm getting confused. I don't know Kara, Erica, they sound the same. I keep getting confused. So I had to change one to Lauren. I've read other books where you have multiple characters that have names that start with the same letter, and I can't keep track of who's who anymore. So that can be kind of confusing. So you want to make sure that you're being abundantly clear and when you're drawing your characters, and that you're abundantly clear in the narration of those characters. Those are the only disadvantages that I could come up with. Pops, did you have any more?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered the disadvantages of third person. That and the way you can accidentally cheat the reader. With third person, the reader is going to be able to know more. So if you're doing a mystery, you can do them in third person, but you have to make sure that you're not lying to the reader to mislead them Usually in a mystery, for example, you'll have the mysteries I've written. I usually have 5 or 6 suspects. And if you watch mysteries, cozy mysteries or whatever, you'll see that you can go through and say, okay, motive, 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 and there's usually 5 or 6 people that have motive to do those kinds of things. So I got to make sure they all stay in the mix, but I don't want to purposely hide something that my point of view character would have seen, but just neglects to mention, or the narrator neglects to mention. Mm-hmm. That's being unfair to the reader, because all of a sudden they're surprised by it at the end. And I think we've all had that experience. You know, we're in the third act and go, wait a minute, where did the gun come from?
Yeah.
Because it was never introduced.
Yeah. I agree. Definitely some things that you want to watch out for there, Pops. What would you suggest, Pops? Do you have some hints for handling third person?
Yeah, there's several. Let me share these. Use the point of view of your protagonist when the protagonist is present. Now, this is not hard and fast. It's not written in stone, but general rule of thumb is if your protagonist is in the scene, that's your point of view person, because he or she is, well, your protagonist. They're the hero of the story. So why would you want to be in someone else's mind? Now, I have on occasion written a few scenes in which the protagonist is a secondary character in the scene. I'm seeing through someone else's eyes. But that's more to reveal that character than it is my protagonist. So my protagonist is playing a minor part. Don't like to do that. Done it only rarely, and mostly because I couldn't find a way out of it, a good way out of it. So rule of thumb, your point of view character is always going to be your protagonist if your protagonist is in the scene. Now, if you're jumping across the Atlantic Ocean and you're going to be in England or something like that, then obviously your protagonist isn't there. You're going to have someone else's point of view. But don't overlook, don't shadow, don't hide your protagonist. Another hint is this: use other character points of view for subplots. Save most of your point of view stuff for your protagonist in the main plot, but if you have subplots going on that are all going to intersect towards the end, then a good thing to do is use a different character point of view for those subplots and make them count. And that means using the point of view of a significant character, whether it's protagonist or antagonist, for those scenes in your subplots. And it doesn't mean that that subplot has to have the same point of view character, but this is one to let some of those supporting characters shine. And here's a no-no. Don't create a point of view character who will appear only in one scene, like a contrivance. This person walks on the scene, gives a bit of information, and walks away and never seen again in the story. That never seems to resonate with the readers. And then the last one I'll give tonight. Readers love or hate your characters based on their action and what's revealed in their point of view. So you want to make sure your readers are connected to that point of view. So you make it vivid, you make it real, you make it in the voice of the character when possible, and it makes all the difference in the world.
Agreed. Very good hints and tips and tricks. I really agree with all of them, but specifically the one where you don't have a point of view character for one scene only. I think that's one of the reasons I didn't like Under the Dome, is where he would write from the point of view of a gopher and then kill it. What did we learn from that? We learned a gopher died. Okay, well, I didn't need 22 pages or whatever it was about a gopher wandering around trying to find food and then getting cut in half. Like I could just see a gopher cut in half and, all right, that's pretty gnarly. Moving on. Just stick with the protagonists where you can. And
yeah, let me address that a little bit, because Stephen King doesn't need to be defended, but Stephen King has written millions of words, and sometimes Dean Koontz did this with a dog. He did a point of view from a dog. He loves dogs. So he did something from a point of view. There are writers who get to that point and have such a high skill level that they can experiment more. It doesn't always mean the reader's going to like it. I had the same problem with Under the Dome. I didn't like the hopping around into creatures that could not have that kind of conscious thought. Okay, that's not a slam against Stephen King. He doesn't get enough credit for being the master wordsmith that he is. But I think sometimes when we read those, especially if they're from famous authors, what we're reading is them spreading their wings, doing something a little different than what they've done over the last 20 years, and trying something new. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But nonetheless, we can always learn from it anyway.
I agree, Pops. You said that well. Stephen King doesn't need to be defended. There's a reason he's Stephen King. He's very, very good. He's an incredible writer, and I think he's stands up with a lot of classic literature. I think he's kind of on that level. He tried something with Under the Dome that I wasn't a huge fan of. Strangely enough, I didn't mind him writing in the point of view of a dog because the dog had an impact on the story. Take the dog out of the story, and the story doesn't end the way that it would have ended otherwise. And he went back to the dog's point of view probably 2 or 3 times. And so that was, I guess, less offensive to me. He does this weird third-person distant portion in it where he's describing the physical makeup of the town, almost describing a map of the town.
Yeah, the book has a map in it, yeah.
Yeah, but he also has a linguistic map of it, which is intriguing to me, where he narrates kind of how the map looks, which is intriguing as well. So he does a lot of point of view work in that particular novel. Some say it's great, some people not so much, but he's Stephen King, so he can do that. There's that. Pops, were you going to say something?
No, I'll say this. One of the best ways to learn point of view is to go to your favorite writers and study what they do. Really, your best mentors are published writers with some history. They've been around a while. So I used to read everything Dean Koontz did, and I always liked the storyline, but that's not the point. The point is, how did he handle the material? What did he do with the dialogue? How did he do physical descriptions? How did he describe weather? How did he do those kinds of things? And so I would study those. He became my mentor, and I would study all those little details. So no matter whether you choose first person, if you choose first person, read some Sue Grafton. If you're going to do, I don't know who to suggest for second person. If you do third person, well, you got all kinds of choices. You just have to now find the third person style that you want. So if you do Under the Dome with Stephen King, it's going to be different than his book about time travel, or our Dreamcatcher, or those kinds of things. Those are going to be different. So study them. They're your mentors. They make a big difference. Don't just. This is one of Al's axioms again. Here's one of my other axioms. Writers ruin their reading. Sacrifice your reading. And by that I mean it's very difficult for me to read for enjoyment, because the better the book, the more I study it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Pops, I've heard you say that. For me, and I do the same thing. I can't read and not analyze anymore. I can't read and not study. Everything I read is immediately subject to analysis and critique. And I've had students, even movies that I go and see, I do the same thing. I'm going to television shows I'm going to watch and I'm going to critique. And I've had students ask me, isn't that boring? Doesn't that ruin everything for you? Can't you just go watch a movie and enjoy it? Well, yeah, I can. But as I'm enjoying it, I'm also analyzing it and critiquing it. For me, it's an enjoyable process. I enjoy reading more now than I did when I was in high school, because I can take it apart and I can learn something new and I can apply it to what I'm doing in life. And that kind of immediate application is encouraging to me. So I get the point that you're saying, the sacrifice you're reading, but I think it's I don't think you have to sacrifice enjoyment. A lot of my enjoyment comes from the study. So I guess it's kind of a same idea, different perspective, but.
Well, and I'm going to agree with you on that, because one thing I love is a well-written book. I begin to relax with it. But boy, if somebody does something right, I stop. Mm-hmm. If there's a well-turned phrase, your mother did this on the book that you have coming out. You have a turn of phrase in there. Forgive me, I forget it now. the Sawyer book, I think it was.
Uh,
And anyway, she just stopped and she read it aloud, and then she read it aloud again. Um, Probably to rub my nose in it, I think. What your son has done. Why can't you do that? But it is a great line, and as a writer, and of course she's read everything I've written, so she's sort of in the same mode of analyzing things. We as writers, when we read great stuff, it's like musicians who hear great music. There's no jealousy. They're moved by it. Same thing with writers. When somebody really does it right, they do it correctly, and oh man, you're now my teacher, and I want to learn whatever I can, because I'm going to steal that idea and put it in my way into my work.
Yeah, I'm glad that Mom did that. I paid her just a ton of money to do that, so I'm glad to know the money was well spent.
Hey, I didn't see any of that money.
Yeah. I wasn't supposed to tell it. Anyhow, but you're right. I've done the same thing. My buddy Dennis, excuse me, Dennis Volgoni, will occasionally have descriptions, and my comments now are just, "This will be in my next book. I am not going to cite you. Don't worry about it." We just tell each other what we're stealing. I'm stealing this. Like, I think it said his finger twitched like a fish, or like twitched like a fish on a line, or something like that. And I said, "That's mine. That will now be my description." So whatever Mom was reading might have originally been his. Who knows? Thanks, Dennis, for that. But he'll take some of my stuff too, and it's all in.
Now let me add this too for our listeners. Don't expect to get this right the first time. This is a constant learning thing, and your second book, your third book, your fourth book will be a different experience. We learn as we go. It is an art. It is not just a craft where you learn to do something and do it over and over and over again. There is art to it, and that means every situation is going to be different. So constantly doing the learning thing, and that to me is half the fun, is learning from people who have gone on before us or are doing the same work right now, and they just do it very well. I just read a bunch of books for a contest I was to judge, and they were all very good. I was surprised by a couple by how good they are, and so I was judging. I was looking for things to grade them down on. I started off looking for things to grade them up on, but they were also good. I had to start looking for little things, and I ended up in a couple of cases with the most useless, nitpicky things because they had done such a fine job. Well, they've been at it for a while, and they've been practicing it, and they've had good editors to work with them on it. So, yeah, learn it as you go. Try to make the next one better, and the next one better after that. And ideally, you should be a better writer at the end of your book than you were at the beginning of your book.
Agreed. Well said, Pops. Well said. We are running out of time here. Molly Jo, questions, comments, concerns from the room tonight?
A lot of conversation going on. It was a really enjoyable chat room and the podcast. Dave Fessenden originally, or in the beginning, said he is the author of Writing the Christian Nonfiction Book, Concept to Contract. He says got some good nonfiction tips in there. Tess suggested a wild card episode idea of historical research. And
Hysterical research?
Historical. You might be hysterical, but the rest of us are preferring historical.
You had me at hysterical.
You could be both hysterically historic. Going in conversations, Dave Fessenden says Vonnegut jumped between third and first person. You can do it tongue-in-cheek, similar to the way the Marx Brothers jump out of the dialogue and talk directly to the audience. Now that's pretty good. Tess DeGroot says Elizabeth Peter does authorial intrusion of sorts at times in her Amelia Peabody stories, primarily first person, but then she'll say, "Dear reader." And for some of the stories, she also drops into third, which she calls manuscript H. The narrator then is an unknown observer. I challenged everybody in the chat room to a homework assignment, which is to people watch and post a very short description on our First in Fiction Facebook page before next week's podcast. Gives a little bit of conversation for next week.
Maybe some of the good ones we can read next week.
That would be fantastic. Okay, game on, room. And Tess said her husband tried to explain omniscient to students as being like God, and one of the students got upset and said, "You're not allowed to talk about God in the classroom." So he said he sees you when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake. Somehow Santa Claus is more acceptable. I don't know if that's cute or sad.
Yeah.
Dave Fessenden popped in with some more comments about third-person POV. He says he has a story with 3 protagonists all together all the time, like the Three Musketeers. He said, what works best for this? Is it sticking with a third-person POV, but from a single character's perspective? I think that's how Lewis does it. C.S. Lewis, he references the silver chair, sticking mostly with Jill's perspective. So his question is, does that work?
Yeah, that's difficult when you have them together all the time, but you should have a primary protagonist. D'Artagnan or somebody like that's going to be the primary one when the 3 are together. If they get separated, then you're getting some subplot in there, and you can do from their point of view in third person. So I would choose one to be the primary protagonist. And if you ever have to jump heads, then be sure and put the, and you know this, Dave, be sure and put the hiatus break in there so the reader knows that something has changed. Yeah, that's often a difficulty. I had that problem when I was working with on the military books because we have a 6-man team and they were often together, but I would choose one character to be the protagonist and the point of view character. Often then when they were separated, I could get into the heads of some of the others. And it's taxing at times to make the right choice.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of third person. I think primarily because I like showing the emotion of at least one character. But when I read it, like you were saying, when it's really well done, it's really well done. Dave also says War and Peace has characters with long last names that seem almost the same. Then they're called by their first names and later by their nicknames. Boy, what a confusing story. I haven't read it. I'll take your word on that, Dave. Tess says that's what she dislikes about the Miss Marple stories. Miss Marple always knows something she doesn't reveal until the end. So that goes what you were saying about disadvantages and what not to do. And then some chatter and people saying it was a great podcast this evening.
Excellent.
Yeah, and Tessa's comment, with those kinds of mysteries, usually whatever it is Miss Marple finds has been indicated someplace in the story. It's the reader's job to catch it. We've talked about The Sixth Sense, the movie, and I'm always angry at that movie because it fooled me. I usually don't get fooled in movies. I always know what's going to happen. That one just took me for a ride from beginning to end. It hooked me like a fish with that, and now I can't even remember where I was going with that.
Because it was revealed.
Yeah, at the end, when we got to the end, right to the end of that movie, I thought, oh no, I know what this is. And then I was angry at myself for not seeing it earlier.
Yeah.
Well, they played fair. They gave me all the information I needed. I just didn't see it. And that sometimes happens in mysteries like that. A comment will be made, be an object that will be seen, and that sort of thing. That's playing fair. If you keep it hidden, then it's not playing fair.
Absolutely. So I think I'm on a bit of a delay, so I apologize if we've been a little delayed lately. But Molly, were you going to say something?
Nope, that's it.
All right. Well, another great cast. I know what I was going to say. I was going to say thanks, Dave, for popping in. Dave is my agent, and I don't know how much I can say about stuff, but we've been talking a lot lately. I'll say it that way. So good things. And don't forget to ask the author. You can do that on aarongansky.com, or you can send it to firstinfictionpodcast@gmail.com, or you can do it right on our Facebook page, or you can send us a tweet on the Twitter. Don't forget to find us at altongansky.com, franklymydearmojo.com, and aarongansky.com. Next week is a wild card. I haven't decided exactly what it will be, so stay tuned to our channels to find out. And thanks so much for listening. Until next week, good writing.